to Steps to Inner Peace, and this is Deb Phelps, and as you know, we are looking at self-compassion this month, and this is the first talk for this month. So what I'd like to go over is what we're doing now. Certainly I did an overview video, which you probably watched, listened to, and maybe you've already begun to look at the worksheet, the self-compassion worksheet. Listen to the meditation and maybe do a few other things. Maybe you're interested in the book study, either joining online, in person, or if you wanted to work with me directly. And certainly you can do so. But with this talk, we're going to look at self-compassion, and we're going to look at it in three parts. We're going to look at the inner critic. We're going to look at self-compassion, and then why is self-compassion so very important? Now, I want you to just take a moment, maybe close your eyes, and just imagine yourself in a situation in which you were disappointed in yourself. So, for instance, because you made a mistake or failed to reach an important goal, or maybe you messed something up. And so just take a moment to think about that. And you probably have what that is. And so think about, what were the words that you spoke to yourself? And what was the tone of the inner voice? And how did it make you feel? So just think about that for a moment. So a lot of times when we're hearing this inner critic, the words are accusatory, reproachful, they're attacking. The tone can be very hard and harsh, angry, disappointed. And of course, the feelings that we can have are feelings of failure, of shame, of guilt, of inferiority, and of course, fear. So sometimes what we hear, the items that we will hear from the inner critic, the internal things. Oh, what is wrong with me? How could I let this happen? Why me? There's nothing I can do right. If I continue this, I'll inevitably fail. Or maybe something like, you fool, you stupid, that sort of way. And so then externally, focusing then on the body, it may be, oh wow, I look really fat in this dress. Or I'm hopelessly inept with computers. Or I have the worst sense of direction of anyone I know. I think I'm the worst cook on this planet. I wonder how many times I've made that same mistake before. Now, does that sound familiar to you? This inner and outer kind of critic, internal and external critic voices that we hear. I mean, really, it's all internal because it's coming from our own mind. Does that sound familiar? I know it does for me. Probably some of those, if not all of them, I have felt at one time or another. Sometimes when we're trying something new, or maybe like that one statement is, oh yeah, I'm making that same mistake again. And we continually beat up ourselves over it. And what does it do but make us feel miserable? It's really what it does. And so what the critic does, it's as if we're saying that I'm going to beat you to the punch and criticize myself before you can. So when we're talking about ourselves, maybe in relationship with somebody else, we look at how flawed and imperfect that I am, so that you don't have to cut me down and tell me what I already know. So it's almost a defense mechanism. In fact, it is a defense mechanism that we do. So the inner critic voice is that internal voice that commands and sends negative messages, right? And so there's three types of messages that it sends us. And so it's imperative, you should do this, or you should do that, or excuse me, it's disapproving thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And certainly negative predictions. You're going to fail at this, whatever it is that you want to do. Take, for instance, that when I decided earlier this year that I felt guided to take yoga teacher training, and I did. And I was excited about it. It was something I had wanted to do for 20 years, for goodness sakes. But then as it got closer to completing and closer to having to put together a class, and mind you, I've been doing meditation and mindfulness for a long time, 38 years. I've been teaching spiritual text, A Course in Miracles, for probably 26, 27 years. I've lost count, actually, early 90s. So I should know, right? There we go. There's that inner critic coming in that, I should know that, it takes time to get used to something, to know it, and to learn it, et cetera, et cetera. But no, as it was getting closer and I did my practicum class, I was really nervous. And then even this week, I did another first class for the public. And I had that nervousness come up and that inner critic coming saying, you failed, you failed. But that's all that is. It's to keep us down and not to know the love that we have within our own hearts. The love that we were created to be, right? Created by the divine, however you imagine the divine for you. So some intrapersonal consequences we have, depression sets in. And listening to that inner critic. We have social anxiety that comes in. We're just, I can't talk to people. And we just feel, and I have felt anxiety over the years myself. Drug addiction and eating disorders. So some interpersonal consequences we have are, actually they did a study, several studies, in fact, those who score high on self-criticism, they have less friends, they're less satisfied with social support, they use more negative communication after a stressful event, and they report lower levels of trust and share a low amount of personal information about how they're feeling. So the possible cause that they found with these various studies that they did is that children with parents who were highly critical, controlling, and performance-focused will be more self-critical as adults. Yeah. So maybe even take a look at yourself in that. I fall in that category, right? I really do. So I've known that in my life, whether it was teaching, doing these videos. Some of you have known me for a long time. I've been doing these videos for a long time, doing podcasts, that sort of thing. It wasn't that easy. I'm actually an introvert, believe it or not. And it takes time for me to feel ready to do it and to just go right in and do it. And there were times that, I can't believe I said that. So all that inner critic voice, and sometimes you'll hear me call it the ego, will come in, that critical voice, and tell me that, you screwed up here, you screwed up there, you should have said this, you should have said that. But the more that I can practice self-compassion, and we'll look at compassion in a moment here, the better I feel. And that's something that I have worked on for a very long time. Now, actually, quite some time ago, I worked with a former Buddhist monk, and he was working with me as we were doing one certification, mindfulness certification. I have several of those, meditation and mindfulness certifications. And he said, the one thing that I see in you, you know and you understand a lot about meditation and mindfulness, but the one thing is that I think you need to work on is loving yourself. I'm a very giving person. He saw that in me, how generous I am, how much I encourage other people, how much I want to see other people succeed. But the one thing was having that self-compassion for myself, having that expression of loving kindness as well. And that's why it's so big for me, because after going through many months of practicing loving kindness meditation, which we'll do, we did a little bit, we did a specific self-compassion loving kindness meditation, as you know, in one of the materials that is on the website. but also just loving kindness in itself, because the whole loving kindness process is starting within and then moving outward to the world. But this month we're really working on ourselves. And I noticed quite a difference within myself, even after all the many, many decades of meditation and mindfulness and the spiritual study that I do, assisting others, all that. I really had to zone in and take time for that quiet and that study for myself. And that's what really, truly made the difference quite some time ago. And yeah, there's still times that I do get self-critical, that I don't practice self-compassion, but I will say that most of the time I do. So let's take a look at compassion. Compassion involves sensitivity to the experience of suffering. That's what it is, coupled with a deep desire to alleviate that suffering as well. So what compassion is not, it's not co-suffering. That doesn't mean that two people are suffering together or someone's being victimized by having compassion for someone else. Compassion involves acknowledgement of pain, acknowledgement of what is going on with it. Now, obviously, if we're with someone else, we're acknowledging their pain. We're understanding the pain and the suffering. We're having some empathy, and we're having acceptance of the person who is suffering. And then compassion also comes in with the wish that suffering may decrease. So how do we switch this over to self-compassion? Well, self-compassion then is simply compassion that's directed inward to us, to ourselves, relating to ourselves as the object of care, of concern, when faced with the experience of suffering. So what self-compassion is not? Well, it's not poor me. Definitely not. It's not self-pity. It's not being isolated from the rest. It's not emotional tunnel vision. That's not what self-compassion is. Self-compassion is taking care, just like when we cut ourselves. Say we're in the kitchen and we cut ourselves. Well, what do? We go and we clean the wound, and we put a Band-Aid, or if it's on our finger, we put something on our finger and we take care of that wound, and we do whatever it takes to help us to heal that wound. Well, being self-compassionate within, the self-compassionate voice is, I tried my best. That's something that the self-compassionate voice, the loving voice, says, that I'm just like everyone else. I'm just a human being. Another piece, I never signed a contract to be perfect, right? I learned something here. I learned, watch where I put my finger when I cut the vegetables, right? And next time, I'll do it a little bit differently. So let's look at some components of self-compassion. So we have kindness, self-kindness, and we have self-judgment. So that's our first component. Our second component is the common humanity and isolation. The third component is mindfulness and over-identification. So when we look at the self-judgment versus the kindness, so the self-judgment is going to be things that are obviously judgmental, harsh, attacking to the self. It's continuing no matter what. And it's going to an external focus to solve the problem. So then when we look at kindness, we're looking at a caring and an understanding, a gentleness, an accepting of the self. It's the stopping, if I need to take a break, to do what I need to do for that self-care. And it's an internal focus of focusing on the self. So let's look at that second component. That second component, the isolation. So the inner critic brings us that isolation, feeling as if this could only happen to you. Who hasn't felt that? I know some of the things that I've dealt with in my life over the years when my children were molested when they were young. I mean, they're much older now. I felt like, oh my God, I'm the only person dealing with this. And I'm sure maybe you felt that way in your life too, with different situations, that sort of thing. We feel isolated from others who are living that normal, happy life. And maybe you've said to yourself, and I know I've said this in the past, oh, I just want my life to be normal. If only it could be normal, right? So that's the isolation piece of that component of common humanity. So the connection piece is experiencing that everybody fails and makes mistakes. Everybody does it. So by knowing that, wow, I'm not alone in this, that we all make those mistakes, that sometimes bad things happen to us, that we do put our foot in our mouth, that sort of thing. And so we can feel that connection, that union with other people instead of feeling alone. And it's a much better feeling to feel connected and one with other people, with nature, that sort of thing. So now let's look at the third component of mindfulness. So the unawareness in the inner critics column, there's no pause, right? It's rush, 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 rush. The thoughts are just rolling like a steam engine down the rails, right? Maybe going off the rails, right? Believing negative self-stories to be true. So all these things that we're saying, oh, I could never do this. I can never, like what I was saying earlier, you know, I was going to go through teacher training 20 years ago, yoga teacher training, and I didn't because some things happened in my life. And so here at 54, going to be 55, what am I doing? What are you thinking? You know, of course those ideas came up, but then I had to remember that I'm being guided to do this, that it feels that this is what I'm to do, that this is the next version or chapter of my life. And not believing, oh, I'm not going to believe that. I'm going to do my best, right? Changing that talk around so that we are encouraging ourselves and loving ourselves. And so also, this inner critic wants to tell us that there's judgment and there's punishment to this, right? If you fail, everybody's going to laugh at you. People won't love you anymore, that sort of thing. So in the mindfulness category, well, the stopping, the awareness, the observing of the negative self-stories that we tell, just observing them, not jumping into the story, but observing the story. And then we're aware of judgment and the punishment that comes up in our mind. So with that being said, what's the importance then of self-compassion? The importance is, well, when we are being self-compassionate, right, loving ourselves, being kind, being gentle to ourselves, there's a lower level of anxiety, there's a lower level of depression, there's less rumination and thought suppression, there's better insight into our feelings and coping with negative feelings. So these are all the intrapersonal effects. So the interpersonal effects, well, we're more emotionally connected, we're accepting, we're autonomy supporting, autonomous. We have higher relationship satisfaction. We have the less need to project our faults onto our partners or friends or coworkers, anyone, via angry accusations. So, now, a common reason that people reject the idea of self-compassion is that they believe that it will cause a lack of motivation, right, to address any personal shortcomings they may have. Well, I'll tell you, that's completely untrue. Because when we are compassionate and aware and loving to ourselves, we will make a difference. We will strive to make a difference because that's what we'll do. Because we're treating ourselves with love instead of the fear. So the motivational effects are a greater personal initiative to make the needed changes in our life. There's more internal reasons for motivation and not social approval. And there's greater intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. So let's look at motivation just a little bit more. So emotion-based self-attack, that's our inner critic, is the wish to punish and judge, the anger, the frustration, the focus on complete self, and the focus on prevention and the fear of failure. That's what the inner critic is doing. So then when we get away from that emotion-based self-attack, we come over to the other column, the other side, to the loving side, the kind side, to the compassionate self-correction. Well, we have the wish to improve. We have support. We have focus on specific aspects of self. And we also have focus on growth and hope for success. So altogether, self-compassion really makes a big difference in our lives. And so when we take the time to be loving to ourselves, whether it's through the self-compassion, loving kindness meditation that I shared with you, if it's through doing some inner work, doing some journaling, some reflection, like with the worksheet where we took that time to imagine what someone else would say to us, someone who loves us and cares about us, and how they would see us and how they would support us and know that, hey, we just made a mistake. And we're not a mistake, as one of my students has said before, that I'm not a mistake. I just made a mistake. And that really is a very compassionate statement right there. So I hope as the month goes on that you'll be really thinking about this, taking some part in the materials that I'm presenting. If you don't, if you can't do the book study, or you don't feel you have the time to work one-on-one with me, maybe even get that book by Kristen Neff, Kristenneff, Self-Compassion, and see what it does for you. See if it helps you along the way. I'll be pulling some exercises here and there. Actually, the first one was kind of based on something in her book and the work she does, and certainly as we go along. So thanks so much for joining with me for our first talk on self-compassion, and I wish you much peace and much love to self and self-compassion. Namaste.